Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife. Today's guest is Bryce Andrews, a rancher, conservationist, and author from Montana. He works with People and Carnivores, a nonprofit aimed to reconnect and restore carnivore populations in the Northern Rockies by working with the region's people to prevent human-carnivore conflicts. He just released his new book, Down from the Mountain, which tells the story of a grizzly bear named Millie, her life, death, and cubs, and what they reveal about the changing character of the American West. It was a really interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only Bryce Andrews. Well, Bryce, thanks so much for joining us on the Escape the Zoo podcast. This is round 2 because I forgot to hit record the first time that we started this. But I was just saying how excited I am for this conversation because we're going to be talking about grizzly bears, and I love grizzly bears, arguably my favorite animal. But we're also going to get into a topic that I'm very, very interested in, which is how do humans cohabitate with such a large apex predator where there is a lot of human wildlife conflict and a lot of interfacing between the species, and something that obviously is a sensitive topic, but also a very important topic. So if you don't mind just kind of kicking things off, telling us a little bit about the book and why you got into this particular field of research and study, and what really moved you into researching this.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thank you, by the way, for having me. It's a pleasure to come on here and be able to talk about the book Down from the Mountain, and also the conservation work that I've been doing. So first off, to the book, the story follows basically the trajectory and life and eventual death of a single grizzly bear from a population in Montana's Mission Valley. And it basically tracks her story as she moves through the last seasonal round of her life, coming out of hibernation in the alpine high country, which in our part of the world is essentially, unchanged from what it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the Rockies in Montana, and the mountains are just too steep, too rugged for people to have built upon. So she's born into that situation, but to survive each year, she needs to come down into the valley, and she has to come down and forage for seasonal food sources, both natural ones and this is a big part of what the book is about. She begins to find human-made food sources. So that might be unsecured garbage, it might be fruit in an orchard, or a corn crop. And so basically this book is about this single bear's life. Her name was Millie, the biologist named her, and the way that she collides with the domesticated world, and the way that her story collides with my story as a person who's involved in field conservation of grizzly bears.
And did you stumble upon Millie's story while she was still living?
I did. I actually stumbled upon her.
Oh, wow.
So a big part of the story of this book is that I ended up working for this really unique, interesting, small conservation group called People and Carnivores. And it's a group with a pretty single-minded focus on reducing conflict in the field between big carnivores like wolves, mm-hmm. and grizzly bears, and people who are living and working in the rural landscape here in Montana. So I went to work for them, and in the course of that work, found my way to the Mission Valley because I'd heard rumors. I knew there was a strong, viable population of grizzlies there, but I had heard rumors about the bears behaving in some really interesting ways. Specifically, that they had begun to come in and come to crops that farmers were growing, like cornfields. Yeah.
Is corn a prevalent crop in Montana? I didn't know that.
Well, in certain parts of the state, it's grown feed corn, but we're a really marginal climate for that, and that's that's a really you're kind of onto something there, because this climate, at least the way the climate's been here for the last several hundred years, has not been a good one for corn. But as we're starting to see the effects of climate change and global warming in this landscape, the season has extended to the point where the combination of that longer season with some of the new, genetically modified corn crops is allowing people to do this in high valleys where it wasn't being done before. And that's having a profound effect on the wildlife, and it's having an effect on the livelihoods of people farming and ranching as well.
What is the difference between feed corn and regular corn? I kind of feel like I have an understanding of it, but
yeah, so
I might be wrong.
So basically, sweet corn is what we eat. It's a crop that was developed to produce basically, a delicious big ear.
Mm-hmm.
The corn that's being grown that these grizzlies are keying in on and coming down from the mountains to get to, it's actually a corn that's grown as a feed or a forage for dairy cattle.
Okay.
So it's grown. It's basically bred or engineered to have the highest amount of biomass, and then it's harvested with a big combine and fed to the cattle as silage.
Isn't it true that a lot of corn being fed to cows is very bad for the cows? So like a lot of the milk and the meat that you're eating from corn fed cows, they're very sickly animals. Is that true?
That's a really, by and large, yes. That's a really complicated thing you're verging on. And before I was doing this work, I was raising grass-fed and grass-finished cattle. So basically the alternative to what you're describing. Cattle are a ruminant grazer, so they're adapted to eating, grass, grasses and legumes of different types. When you begin to feed them on a principally grain diet, it changes the chemistry of their rumen, actually makes it more acidic,
Mm-hmm.
which makes them more prone to certain diseases, and also changes the way they develop fat within their bodies. And that's basically what begins to make it less healthy.
And has that been having a similar effect on the grizzlies? Like, have you been able to tell if this unique population of grizzly that's stumbling into the corn are somehow developing?
Sure. Yeah. So the grizzlies are, they're more like us than like a cow.
Okay.
So a grizzly reacts differently to corn, which is to say they don't have a rumen. They have a stomach like we do. And they can actually process corn pretty well and turn it into a lot of fat. And that's good for them in the short term and up to a point, because a bear's challenge every single year is to get through the year, develop enough fat to last through winter.
Mm-hmm.
So they're always trying to eat as much as they can when they're up and moving. So the corn helps them do that. But just as corn acts upon us, we eat a lot of corn in the form of high fructose corn syrup.
Sure.
Just as that tends to make us overly obese and also acts to basically destroy our mouths, that's kind of what we see with the bears. A lot of them get too fat, some to the point where they struggle to run out of the field. And then, when you look at the mouth of a bear that's been eating corn, to hear some of the biologists who are most familiar with the situation talk about it, you might find, say, a 7-year-old corn bear with the dentition of a 15-year-old bear eating wild or natural forms of food. And that's because of the amount of sugar and carbohydrate in there. Yeah.
And is the main stressor, the concern, especially with your work in People and Carnivores, is it because the bears are in the corn and they're taking out a large portion of it, or is it more concern over the welfare and the safety of the population around those cornfields?
Yeah, it's kind of all of those things. And let me tell you how. First of all, the fact that bears go to that field in the numbers that they do, and up to 16 grizzlies have been documented at one time in that field.
How big's the field, just for perspective?
It's about 80 acres, so it has about a 2-mile perimeter.
So that's a lot of grizzlies for 80 acres.
Yeah, I mean that's a concentration that makes you think Alaskan salmon stream. It's a concentration that very rarely happens in our part of the world. But what that's doing is it's doing a few things. number one, it's, as I just said, physiologically, it's bad for the bears. Number two, it's destroying their seasonal round. So when they're in that cornfield, where they should be is very high up on the peaks, hitting these colonies of insects that accumulate in the late summer and early fall. So what it does is it keeps those bears, it stops them from going way back into the mountains where they're not going to get into trouble with people, and it keeps them in a valley in a situation where it's much more likely that they're going to run into people and have conflict.
And I would assume a lot of their hibernation is up high, right? So if you're this bear who's just like snacking on this corn and getting super fat, it must be kind of hard to get up there in time. Is that a concern too?
I think that might be a little less of a concern because they're just such tough animals. Even if they're,
I'm just playing biologist and trying to throw out some suggestions that may make no sense, but just throwing it out there.
Yeah, but they definitely have to get, they do hibernate high. Even the ones that come to this field, they still go back to elevation. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's disrupting their seasonal round, and this is a really important part. It's also it's a massive impact on the dairy farmer. He was losing at one point, I believe, like a quarter of his corn crop before I started working on this project. Experimental fence design. Before that began, he was losing a massive amount of corn, which was making it harder and harder for him to make ends meet.
And what was his relationship like with the Grizzlies? Was it one of animosity, or was it one where he's like, this sucks, but we need to figure out a solution?
It was the latter. Greg Schock is the dairyman, and I have a lot of respect for him. He has made his living there on a very slim margin of profit. It's very hard to be a family dairy anymore because you're competing with massive agricultural companies that are essentially forcing the price per unit down so far that it's hard for families to make ends meet. He was doing that, and the bears are a further strain on him. But I've never actually heard him speak negatively in a categorical way. Mm-hmm. I've heard him complain a lot about the damage they do. And, certainly the damage that they do has driven his operation into a place where he doesn't know to this day whether he'll be able to continue it.
And so, well, it's encouraging to hear that he's understanding. I'm sure it's different like that depending on the dairy farmer that you're talking to, and understandably so. It is their livelihood. What are the solutions you're looking at? You mentioned the fence protection. Is there what is a lot of the work that People and Carnivores are doing? I'm sure the education component is a huge piece of that. Yeah,
so we work in a lot of different ways, and we work principally with grizzly and wolf conflict because that's sort of the highest stakes stuff right now in the state. But in terms of the tools that we use to reduce conflicts, I'll just talk specifically about grizzlies right now because that's been the focus of the book. But we do backcountry work. So I put up food storage structures, bear poles where you can a hiker or a backcountry hunter can hang their food out of the reach of bears. That reduces conflict. We work with sanitation, so we help different communities get carcass composting set up so that they're moving dead livestock and dead deer and elk, dead roadkill off the landscape, mm-hmm. and reducing the attractants that bring bears into conflict with people. And then we do projects. We do a lot of stuff, but we also do projects like the one that brought me to the Schock Dairy, which is we look at the tools that we have at our disposal to live better with these animals, and we seek to refine them and to experiment with them and to make them more useful. And specifically what I was doing on Schock's place is taking a design of grizzly fence that had proved really promising in some trials in a nearby valley, mm-hmm. Small scale trials, and trying to use it to keep bears out of this large attractant. And the important thing to know about this fence is that it was really fences are, they're waist to breast high, and they involve 5 to 7 wires, and they cost a lot to build, and they cost so much to build that it makes it basically economically impossible for a family farmer to do it. Now, what we were doing was a 3-wire fence that was only 25 inches tall, and it could be built for a cost that was, I believe, less than a third of a standard bear fence.
Oh,
so
wow.
it was a technology that, the technology promised to basically make it economically possible to deter bears on that scale from crops like that.
And has it proven to be pretty successful thus far?
Well, in the first year, we reduced crop loss by about 75% and a similar reduction in the number of bears accessing the field. And that's a very tidy way of me saying it didn't work perfectly. One of the things,
it's better than nothing. That's for sure.
It's definitely better than nothing. And it can be more effective still. One of the things that this whole experience has taught me is you cannot beat bears at being resourceful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're incredibly persistent, crafty animals when it comes to getting into a place where they know there's a food reward.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the course of the summer that this book is about, I had built that, which was, a pretty massive job. And then, a lot of this story has to do with the ways that bears get in and the ways in which I try to stop them and how Millie, the bear who's really the focus, how her story sort of kind of mixes into that entire situation.
Can we talk a little bit about Millie without giving away the ending of the book? What was specifically interesting about Millie's experience and Millie's story versus the other bears that are getting into these cornfields?
Sure. Yeah, I think grizzlies are interesting because of all the animals on the landscape here, they're the one that I think we are most naturally driven to know as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is like, somebody reports a bear and all the neighbors say like, oh, was it the sow with the blonde fur around her neck? Was it been coming for 10 years? Everybody wants to know these bears as individuals. And that's how I've always known them in, 10 years of working as a ranch manager and now another 3 or 4 years of working in grizzly conservation. Millie, I knew her because of her damage. She showed up on one of my trail cameras. That was the first I ever saw her. She showed up with this just really, really heartbreaking damage to her face. She had been wounded in a way that was pretty mysterious at the time and was basically wasting away. And she was wasting away inside the fence. So she had somehow managed to breach that fence and get into the cornfield, but she was unable to survive even in that infinity of food. Yeah. So, and I guess, the thing that's heartbreaking about her situation is that, we had collar data from her. So she'd been trapped for a research project about 10 years beforehand. And so we knew what her history was. We knew she'd been coming to that corn for a long time and that in spite of the odds, she had avoided conflict and litters of cubs over a decade, more than a decade. So there you had a bear that was adding to the population, a population that we all are actively trying to increase, and a bear who was making a living on the edge of grizzly occupied habitat. So she was one of those bears that could have expanded the range of the species to fill in places where we historically had grizzlies, but where we wiped them out earlier in the 20th century. So it's a tragedy that,
I don't understand that. So she gets stuck in this fencing. She has all the food in the world. Why was she wasting away? And what was that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's funny. It's a person doesn't want to give away too much of how the story unfolds, but I think it's important. And
I mentioned it to you just to give context to the listeners too. I literally got the book less than 30 minutes ago, so I haven't read this, and I don't want any spoilers either. So we'll try and keep it spoiler free, but that's just like piqued my interest, is to kind of get a sense of if the wound was that the human conflict going on? Did somebody wound her?
Yeah. so I want to tell this story because I think it's an important one. And I did subtitle the book "The Life and Death of a Grizzly," so it's hard to offer more of a spoiler than that in terms of how it ends for her. But I'll tell you this: Millie lived in this landscape successfully, and it's a really hard landscape to make your living in because this all takes place on in the Mission Valley on the Flathead Indian Reservation, which is where I live. And on the reservation, you have a lot of bears, you have a lot of people by Montana standards, and you have a lot of unsecured attractants. There's small livestock like chickens, pigs, goats. There's garbage that's not appropriately locked up. You have all of these things that can get a bear into trouble. But Millie didn't get into trouble. She lived well in this landscape for quite a long time. As far as we can tell, she was born around the turn of the millennium, and lived until 2016. She did really well in that landscape, and she ended up running afoul of somebody with a shotgun under mysterious circumstances. So Millie, she took a load of birdshot to the face at pretty close range in circumstances that were never fully unraveled. And that's what led to her death. And I think, the reason I tell that, I want people to know, this may not be of too much use to listeners who are living in an urban context, but in rural Montana, there's this sensibility that a grizzly is something invincible, right? They're strong animals, they're tough, and people will sometimes use a really light shotgun load to drive off bears. Or they'll take a shot at a bear with a shotgun thinking that it's going to be painful but not lethal. Millie's a really good example of how that's just not true, because bears are really susceptible to infection and the kind of damage that even a small, pellet like that, or a load of pellets can do. Really be the end of a bear.
It's so disheartening to hear stories like that too, because the worst situations when humans and wildlife come into conflict for me are situations like that, situations like drift nets where a shark gets caught in a drift net that's catching everything that swims by it, and it just sits there and dies for hours, this like slow and painful death. And that's like hearing something like that this poor bear gets shot in the face, or like allegedly, and has to just sit there and suffer a slow decay of a death because of that is just so sad to think about.
It is, and I think it's particularly poignant in light of the fact that we have a really crucial opportunity right now to do right by the grizzly bear, and it's a time-sensitive one. So let me put Millie's story in a bit larger context. This is all happening north of Missoula, Montana. And in Montana now, you've got two main populations of bears. There's a northern population that kind of exists around Glacier National Park in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. You've got a southern population existing in the greater. And between those two, you have unoccupied habitat. So Millie, and the setting for this story is basically the southern end of the northern population. Okay. So
I've seen the southern population in Yellowstone, and it was mind blowing. Oh my God. Like seeing a wild grizzly bear is something that I can't even articulate into words, and I'm not overblowing this. It was one of the most majestic things I've ever looked at.
Yeah.
I was doing this road trip with my buddy, and we were going around. I know I'm pulling you out of your story. I'm sorry to do this like tangent, but we were doing a road trip through 7 of the national parks in the Western US. And we spent 2 days in Grand Teton National Park going around. And to your point, we were looking for, it wasn't, oh yeah, we want to find a grizzly bear. They were like this specific one. It was like P34 or something like that. We were going around trying to find him, couldn't find him. Then we left Jackson Hole and drove up to Gardner, Montana, which is just at the like the northern entrance, I believe, of Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And drove into the Lamar Valley for 3 straight days, saw nothing. And then we were supposed to head up to Bozeman because we were going to Glacier National Park for the next week. And we had to meet our friend at the Bozeman airport at 10 a.m. and it was like a 2.5 hour drive. So we woke up at 3 a.m, drove into the Lamar Valley, like just in time for sunrise. And sure enough, like right when the sun came out, 4 grizzlies were walking into the valley. And it's just hard to explain how important of a cultural icon that is for America and how majestic and amazing of a creature it is. Long story short, that's where my love for grizzlies come in. And I just wanted to get that out there, but I'd love to hear more about kind of where you were going, about the greater context of these things.
Oh yeah. And I'll get there, but I really want to say that what you just expressed about how moving it is to encounter a grizzly in the wild, I agree completely. I wrote about that, and the experience. So I used to manage a ranch that's just north of the part of Yellowstone that you're describing.
Okay.
A ranch that basically backed up to Yellowstone. So unbroken wild country between the place where I was grazing cattle and the place where you saw those grizzly bears.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, riding a horse. Grizzlies are crepuscular animals. They love those in-between times between day and night.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going out to gather cattle or going out to, look for trespassing hunters during hunting season and riding a horse through and encountering bears. And there's the experience of looking into the eyes of an animal like that when you encounter one. It is profoundly necessary. And it's a thing that's, I think, really missing from the modern existence for a lot of people, because every time I've had that experience, I'm left with these two really strong paired feelings. One, I feel humbled.
Sure.
And two, I feel very lucky. I feel gratitude. And those feelings of humility and gratitude, that's something that you can get. It comes from the perspective that jumps into you when you encounter an animal that actually exists a little bit higher than you do on the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just a matter of it's not just a matter of I'm afraid and, I'm afraid and later I'm glad because I'm not eaten. I mean, although that's part of it. It's the fact that you encounter, there's a measure of recognition. A bear's eyes, they're kind of the same, despite how big they are. Their eyes are kind of the same size and distance apart as ours. So you really feel like you're looking you're looking at a creature that has a similar way of experiencing the world or something like that. That may be going too far, but there's something in that gaze.
No, I mean, one of my favorite podcast episodes we did was with Carl Safina, and he wrote Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel. And it's all about understanding the emotional complexity of animals. And for me, the more and more you dig into any specific species of animals, and it's so easy when you get into the megafauna, to understand that they live lives that are so important and equally worth respecting to a human life, in the sense that they're raising families, they're going out, they're playing, they have trials, they have tribulations, they share joy and happiness and emotion and sadness and grief. And to me, like, seeing something like that, it puts it into perspective that's not like foofy, and that's not, it's nice to know. It's like a very real experience. And for me, seeing them, like, to me, the biggest thing I felt, and I've lived in urban areas for the last 10 to 15 years of my life. So for one, just getting out into northern Montana and never seeing that part of the country before, I was like, holy shit, this is the most beautiful place I've ever been to in my life. But on top of that, you're just like, it's so easy to be disconnected from hearing things about climate change or populations of animals. And like, yes, I want the endangered species to do well, but when you actually see them and you understand them and you can relate to them, then, like, for me, it was more of like this absurdly passionate move to want to protect something like that. It's just like, it's just so, it provides so much perspective, and it's such a beautiful thing to share. I don't know. For me, that's what I found the most moving, is I was just like, we can't lose this. Like, this is too good.
Right. There's something that came home really clearly to me in the course of doing this work and then writing this book. And it has something to do with what you just said. So in the course of doing the work and writing the book, I became really involved with and entangled in the story of one bear, right? In the story of Millie, and then subsequently in the stories of the two cubs that she left behind as orphans. What that taught me is I had spent 10 years before that as a rancher, and a rancher in some of the wilder corners of Montana. So I was in a position where I was seeing wildlife all the time. I was interacting with bears and wolves. But what her story really did is it forced me to acknowledge her as an individual. And so once I did that, and once I looked closely at what, her as an individual, not as just a representative of bears generally.
Sure.
I started to think of her story in more human terms. I started to think about it as a heroic story because of how difficult it is for a bear to survive in that landscape. And I started to think of it as a tragic story. And the real kicker for me was I realized that that's how I was thinking of her story. And for a while I thought, my God, this bear is exceptional. And then the thing that really floored me is that she's not. She's not exceptional. It's that wild animals are leading these heroic, tragic lives all around us all the time. And engaging with one animal can open the door to all that.
Yeah. It's storytelling at its most basic level, right? I mean, the more and more any compelling story is when you get down to the individual level and you understand the trials and tribulations of that person. And oftentimes, I mean, that's every powerful movie or book that you've ever watched or read. It's just basic fact that the more powerful a story can be is when it's told at the individualistic level. And oftentimes the only thing you're hearing about wildlife outside of planet Earth or the very few documentaries that the general population watches are very 30,000 foot view as to this is how the bear population is doing. And this is like as long as that trend isn't pointing towards extinction, people are like, okay, they're good for now, as opposed to like really thinking about the well-being and understanding. But I also I think it's super important. This is kind of me talking about my whole thought in general on politics right now, where nobody wants to talk about it. It's so polarizing. I know this is a wildlife podcast. I understand that I've dedicated my whole career to kind of trying to help and support wildlife, but I'm also not ignorant to the other side of the perspective as to where this conflict comes into play. And a really good example of that is when I was in Montana, in Gardner, experiencing these grizzly bears. I was staying at this lodge just outside of Gardner with this family who was the nicest people in the world, like salt of the earth. I think they were like 9th generation, 12 Montanans or something to that. No joke. That I'm pretty sure their direct relatives were the first Caucasian baby to be had in Montana. Like they were telling me this crazy story. It was just a wild story. But I spent there, I think 2 or 3 nights there, and they had this beautiful ranch with like a bunch of sheep and lambs and horses. And it was just, it was absolutely fantastic. And it was like out of a fairy tale. And then lo and behold, like 3 weeks later, when I got back to Los Angeles, I was Googling about my journey and where I'd gone. And I found out that this exact family had been involved in an incredibly controversial situation where a wolf had gotten in and basically just killed all of his lambs and sheep one day. And then he kind of went out with a vendetta, found the wolf and shot it to death, and got a ton of hate mail for it. And I don't know, like I look at something like that and there is that side of it where you're like, okay, everybody knows the Yellowstone wolf story where they were reintroduced into the Yellowstone. The entire ecosystem is doing so much better because they're around. But I can also understand the idea of this rancher who has spent his entire career trying to create a life for his family. And these wolves were reintroduced at some point during his career. And now overnight, he has to worry about them taking out and killing half of his livestock population. Like I get that that's a thing. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so like, I don't want my obsessive, passionate stance on wildlife to make it seem like I can't be objective as to like what's going on. You know what I mean?
Right. I understand that. I understand that situation very well, and from a couple of different angles, because, my first book, Bad Luck Way, was largely about the experience of working as a ranch hand on the edge of Yellowstone,
Mm-hmm.
as a conservation minded person who came from a city, and
Oh, so you didn't.
the fact.
Can you talk to me through that journey? How did you go from living in a city to working on a ranch and raising cattle in Montana?
Yeah, I'm super weird. I think that's what it amounts to.
Because I always just kind of assume that's more of a profession that you're kind of born into.
Yeah, I think that's true for the most part. I'm probably the only kid in my high school's history to write, a senior paper on range management in urban Seattle. But I was just always curious about it, and my folks are very involved in the art world in Seattle. My dad ran the University of Washington's art museum. My mom is an artist, and through that they met the Zentz family. My atheist godparents, and Pat Zentz is a sculptor and third generation rancher outside of Billings in Montana. So I learned ranching from him, and then I sought it out as soon as I had finished with college in Eastern Washington. I moved to take a job on the Sun Ranch in the Madison Valley, and that's where my first book came from. And it's funny that you mentioned that issue with wolves, because that book is about trying to ranch with wolves. We had running about 1,500 head of yearling cattle and had a resident pack of 13 wolves on this 21,000 acre ranch. Mm-hmm. And we began to lose cattle with incredible frequency and regularity. And through a series of really, really interesting circumstances, I ended up a kid who'd never grown up hunting or anything. I ended up having to kill one of these wolves. And that was a really, really hard thing for me to do, and something that I, felt a tremendous amount of guilt over, but also still understood that this is something I've been trying to drive home to people for a long time, is that coexistence between people and wild animals in the West is not now, nor ever will be, bloodless or perfect. The idea of the two species sharing the landscape, certain amount of loss of livestock, loss of wildlife, loss even of people at times. That's what coexistence looks like. So though a big part of my life is trying to reduce conflicts, I've spent enough time trying to make a living from agriculture in this landscape to know that we will never reach a perfect détente. We'll never reach a perfect peace between wildlife and agriculture, or wildlife and human beings generally in this landscape. We just have to keep trying to perfect it all the same.
Do you think, wow, that's a really powerful story. I didn't know that. Do you think, now that you've spent so much time working with people and carnivores, because your first book came out in 2013, 2014?
Yeah, did.
Would you have handled that situation in the same way?
Was the question, I'm sorry, cut out for just a bit. Would I have handled the situation the same way?
Do you feel like that the shooting and taking down of the wolf was a necessary thing, or do you think in retrospect, now that you've spent more time working with this, that there was another solution?
I think it has to do, well, I think it's hard to answer that question in like a simple, clear way. Sure. Because we did try at the time all of the tools, the coexistence tools that were available to us. Mm-hmm. It was a ranch owned by a guy who came from California and wanted to demonstrate conservation principles in the context of ranching.
Yeah, and for clarification, I understand you're a conservationist who's writing books about this and working with this. It by no means is it like an aggressive question. It's more just like an inquisitory question. I'm interested because there's pieces where it's like, yeah, sometimes it's a last resort, but also to your point, I would assume that a lot of the ways that people and carnivores would go about mitigating something like that is like a systematic, long-term infrastructure based solution to some of these things.
Yeah. I think one thing that I really want to express clearly is that a lot of what we can do to live better with wildlife is proactive rather than reactive.
Mm-hmm.
So like in the case of the Sun Ranch, which is where I was working way, we had a wolf pack that had keyed in on the cattle herd. So that had become their primary food source.
Sure.
And in spite of the hazing that we did, in spite of sleeping out with the cattle, the landscape was just too large and too rugged for us to be everywhere at once. So those wolves continued to kill cattle. And so that really did feel like a last resort.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could go down a whole rabbit hole here too by saying that like we were 3 people taking care of 1,500 cows, and the ratio is wrong to actually protect those animals. I mean, those are not and that has to do with the economics of modern ranching. And this is where this comes full circle to politics and economics and some big hairy issues. You know, the reason that we ended up in a situation where the only option to us to stop the wolves from killing those animals was to kill a wolf is because of the fact that modern agriculture exists on such a slim margin that when you go to a class, like there's a class called Ranching for Profit. When I went to Ranching for Profit, which is a business training thing for ranch managers, the ratio that they were telling you to shoot for in terms of cowboy to cow is 1 to 500.
Yeah, it's insane.
And so that what they're saying is you will not be able to make money. You will not be able to continue doing this if you don't hit that threshold. So what's weird about this is like, are there things we could have done differently to avoid the situation on the Sun Ranch? Yes, but it involves actual societal change in terms of how we eat, how we compensate people practicing agriculture, and how we approach living in landscapes like this. So they're huge issues that it opens onto.
This is the least sophisticated response to what you just said, because that's a really profound thing. But do you know that is the first time that I ever put 2 and 2 together? This is going to make me sound very dumb. That the reason they call them cowboys is that true? Because they're the guys who kind of go out and look after the cows. I've never thought of that before. I know that's not like, you know how like I always think of like every individual has one kind of blank spot that like for some reason or another they just didn't pick up on, like a certain fact or a certain thing, and that might be the one for me. That I've literally never put 2 and 2 together.
Well, I think for a long time in our family, there was a whole generation in my mom's family that believed that the Pulitzer Prize was actually the Pulitzer Prize, like a surprise chicken. So I think that's pretty common.
Oh, that's so funny. But kind of bringing it back, I totally understand that sensitivities as to something like that. What do you see low-hanging fruit? Like, are you optimistic about how you can implement those societal systematic changes to start allowing this coexistence to be a little bit more fruitful or a little bit more
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate because it's like we've done such a bad job so far that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, the work that I do with People and Carnivores and that a lot of other people do, both in agencies and in the nonprofit sector, in terms of reducing some of these things that are perennial causes of conflict and wildlife death, like unsecured garbage, like, you know, livestock in an area where they really shouldn't be, you know, like is doing that stuff. I mean, that begins, so those are kind of win-win situations, right? When you do those, you have less crop loss for the corn farmer and you have less death loss for bears.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kind of things that get people behind this work. Now, I want to, and this is maybe a good place for us to go with this conversation toward the end of it, is, you know, there is like I began to say, there's a real opportunity for us right now because we have some strongholds of bears. We have the glacier and the Yellowstone populations. We also have a lot of a lot of land and habitat that remains undeveloped and unfragmented where those bears could survive. And what we have to do is we have to make sure that bears can move from the places where they're surviving and thriving right now to the places where we want them to be. And what that takes is raising awareness of what bears need from the landscape and what we have to do to coexist well with them. So to your question about are there things we can do, there are some very practical things we can do in that direction. In this part of the world, we need to zone. Zoning has been a bad word in Montana for a long time, but we need to make sure that the corridors that could lead bears from the places where they survive now to the places we want them to live in the future, we need to make sure that those are not built up, paved over, and otherwise rendered useless to bears. We also need to begin to think about these animals and think about their needs when we do things like plan our transportation systems and enact our land use laws. So, I mean, there's some really practical things we can do. And by and large, and we have to attend more to the stories of individual animals. And that's what I hope this book will do. I hope people will know Millie through this story, will stir them to act on behalf of the species.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I think the proactive piece of that is what is so important. I think oftentimes we're so reactive, and the one thing that here's the one thing that you mentioned, and I just want to dig into this real quickly,
Sure.
is that oftentimes in the way that this relationship has happened, there's been some bloodshed on one side or the other, whether it be the wildlife, potentially even humans, or realistically even humans, and then like obviously economic factors. What is the frequency which people are actually the victim to these apex predators like a wolf or a grizzly? And the reason I ask is because obviously that's when it gets really sensitive, and understandably so. What is the frequency of something like that? And is that something that a lot of these proactive measures can help to address?
Yeah. So I can't give you an exact number. It's very low. I mean, the numbers of grizzly attacks, grizzlies are the primary animal that makes, real trouble in terms of making people their prey, or, reacting badly in a way that leaves somebody maimed or killed. The number of grizzly encounters of that sort per year is very low for the number of them that are on the landscape and the vast number of us that are there. The tools that we're working on, the kinds of things that keep bears away from densely occupied human areas and, keep bears from associating humans with food, that definitely is going to lead to fewer negative encounters. Now, it won't eliminate them altogether because the bear is a top order predator. And when you encounter a grizzly randomly in the woods, there's a chance that bear will either see you as a threat and attack you because of that, or see you as food and act accordingly. We'll never, I don't think that if we want this landscape to remain wild, we have to make our peace with the fact that that's always going to be a possibility. But we can do things to reduce the risk. Bear spray is a huge deal around here. We give out a lot of it. I evangelize on behalf of bear spray whenever possible.
I have some in my apartment that I didn't end up using in Glacier National Park. So if anybody breaks into my apartment, they got it coming to them.
Yeah. Well, you should definitely go light on the spraying of intruders, because I think it can do permanent damage to a person's. I actually had a can blow up in a truck cab with me once. It was one of the most. I just got a little bit of it because I got out, but it was one of the most awful feelings I've ever had.
Yikes.
I know why that stuff works.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to interrupt you while you're talking about life-saving measures. So let's get back into that.
No, carrying bear spray is absolutely a life-saving measure. Statistically, people tend to do better with bear spray in a bear attack than they do with a handgun in terms of their own survivability. It's really effective and works. And then also, as we continue to do things like put up these backcountry food structures, and as we continue to all sorts of ways to eliminate the circumstances that put people and large carnivores in conflict, I mean, that is going to have a beneficial effect on survivability for the species, and it's going to limit the number of people who get into nasty situations with bears.
Yeah, and I think what's important about that is the proactive piece is really important, and also just understanding what is a realistic world that we can coexist with wildlife. And that's why I really like concepts like E.O. Wilson's Half Earth, which I'll link in the show notes for anybody that wants to look at it. But the concept being is that as we become more technologically advanced across all parts of the world and things become a little bit urbanized, that people are tending to colonize into these urban areas a lot more than before. And maybe there's just the ability to parcel off these pieces of land and say, this is completely wild habitat, and this is where the wildlife is going to go. And we are going to take as many proactive measures as possible so that if you as an individual want to go into these areas, like, you'll be as safe as we can make you. But we also need to make it very clear to people that there is an assumed risk with going into those places. And maybe there's a way that you can make that balance. I think what's worse is when you market wild places as like a beautiful place to bring your family for camping or something to that effect. And that's when, if something horrific does happen with a bear encounter, it's met with such animosity and met with this disdain to start culling the species, that I think a lot of that falls on the shoulders of us needing to understand what's wild and what's not. And to your point, zoning off places and making sure that those corridors are in place so that when families are in these areas, they know they're safe. Or if it's not safe, then the proactive measures are there, but it's kind of at your own risk type situations. But I think the biggest problem is just kind of being like, oh yeah, it'll all work itself out. And that's when you end up getting these terrible stories that are met with such terrible backlash, you know?
And I do want to say, because I've not read Half Earth yet. It's on my list of things that I'd really like to read in the near future. So I don't know exactly what the thesis of that book is, but
yeah,
I do want to say
I also don't, I haven't finished reading it. I agree with the general concept. I don't know how practical I personally believe the actual implementation of something like that is. I'd like to believe it's true, and the guy is a Harvard professor, so I'm sure he's pretty smart. But I'm with you on that perspective, just to clarify. I just want to say that in addition to setting aside areas that we intend to remain wild, we have to work really hard to make sure that our civilization, our developed landscape, is permeable to wild animals. We have too many people to refrain from facing up to that. What I mean by that is that, like, I just described some big pockets of habitat: Yellowstone, Glacier, the Selway Bitterroot, which is one of the places where we really hope to see grizzlies in the near future. The valleys that are between those big strongholds of habitat, they already have people in there. They have people pursuing agriculture, people who have pursued residential development, all kinds of people making their lives. So I think it's absolutely essential, think not just of setting aside reserves for wild animals, but of making the places that we have claimed to live and work in, making those places safer and more welcoming and more useful to wildlife as we move into this, as we move into the next century here. And by doing that, as a byproduct, you could also probably make it safer for people too, just by
that would be
having those measures in place to understand as to how to create safety for animals and human populations and civilizations will also probably help the humans as well. So that's why I just think that type of work is so important, because if we do want to have these apex predators in the world, which would be a travesty if we don't, we have to find a better way to kind of interact with them and not just be super reactive.
I agree.
So I know we're getting close on time here. I just wanted to go into some quick rapid fire questions real quickly.
Sure.
Next 5 years, like, what's your focus? If you could kind of tackle certain projects that you think are really, really important and you want to chunk off the next 5 years of your career towards, what would that look like?
Well, my fiance Jillian and I, we're going to be married in June. We bought a farm together. It's a small ranch or big farm. I don't know how you want to classify it, but it's north of Missoula. just on the edge of a wilderness. And so a big project of our next 5 years will be beginning to raise animals there and also grow some fruit there. And at the same time, do what we can to make that place a resource for wildlife. So we want to work on some reforestation projects. We want to do what we can to make our living from that landscape and demonstrate that we can do that without adversely affecting the wildlife that need to use that land as well.
Congrats. That's really exciting.
Yeah, I know it is. I'm really excited about it. I also want to continue my work with People and Carnivores, and I'm just starting into a new book. So
what's the new book on? Can you tell, or is that a secret for now?
I don't know. I can't tell you in an articulate way. That's why I have to write the book.
Okay. That's fair. How about nonprofits that people could support that help to further this mission or that you particularly care about? Obviously, People and Carnivores, and I'll link to that in the show notes. Is there any other organizations that jump to the top of your head that are doing great work in this realm?
Yeah. I mean, People and Carnivores is pretty unique in the degree to which it's on this field-based conflict reduction stuff. But other groups doing good work in addition to People and Carnivores are the Vital Ground Foundation, Great Bear, NRDC, Defenders of Wildlife. I mean, a lot of those. So that's kind of a scattershot of groups who work on similar issues in different ways. So like some are more policy-based, some are more field-based. But there's definitely a community of groups working on that. I'd put in a plug for us just because we're a tiny, locally based nonprofit. And so it's year to year, it is always a process and an effort to secure the funding to get what we need to get done.
Favorite wildlife book and documentary?
Oh, man. That's unexpected. I would say I always liked Sand Almanac a lot. But
Sorry,
I also
just cut out there. What did you say?
Oh, sorry. Here's a couple. Sand County Almanac is a book I've always liked a lot. And Of Wolves and Men, Barry Lopez's Of Wolves and Men is a book I like quite a bit.
Have you ever read Grizzly Year?
No.
Have you heard of it?
No.
Oh man, I'm gonna get an email from you in a few months saying that this was the best recommendation I've ever given you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's this crazy.
It's
this crazy book about a guy in the 1970s, 1980s who was a Vietnam vet, came back, and was very understandably dealing with some mental issues from the stuff that he saw in Vietnam. And basically, his way to cope mentally was to camp out for 6 to 8 months out of the year in Yellowstone and Glacier and just do some of the most incredible survey work on grizzly bears. So he just he just filmed and documented and encountered so many different grizzlies, and he kind of paralleled that with what he was going through mentally to kind of process what he had dealt with at war. And it's a fantastic, fantastic read. I highly recommend it.
Well, that's Doug Peacock, right?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, he was the inspiration for George Washington Hayduke and Edward Abbey's Monkey Wrench Gang.
Oh, really?
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
I only learned it a couple of days ago because they're showing the documentary here in Missoula, actually the same day my book comes out. So,
oh, amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you give a little plug to the book real quick again?
Sure. Down from the Mountain, The Life and Death of a Grizzly.
Where can people get it? Amazon?
Yeah, I'd prefer they got it from a local bookstore if they can. It's definitely on Amazon. It's an audio book, an iBook. It's all the different kinds of book.
Did you read it, the audiobook?
Have I listened to the audio yet?
No. Are you the narrator?
Oh, no. No, they won't trust me with that.
I'm super excited to read it. I'm literally looking at it as we speak. I have two questions, last questions. Favorite moment. So a time that you were out in the wild doing your thing where you could get really present and just say, I can't believe I get to do the work that I get to do for a living.
Kind of a weird one, but I was walking through the cornfield. I had to go in there. There was a reason that I had to go into it. And I remember coming into one of these spaces in the corn where the Grizzlies had knocked down about a 10-meter diameter circle in the course of feeding. I just remember being in there and thinking, this is crazy. I can't believe I do this for a living. So that's the first one that springs to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just think for anybody also that hasn't spent any time in that area of the country, that is hard to beat. I kind of was just walking around there being like, I can't believe I get to even be a part of this landscape. That's the true like existential, make you feel small compared to the mountains that are surrounding you kind of moment. And my last question, if you could put a billboard on the side of a major highway that disseminates one message in 10 words or less, what would you put on that billboard?
Have fewer babies.
You know, you're not the first person to say that.
Really? Do you want me to take another crack at it?
No,
Sure
I think it's
slogans.
so interesting how that keeps coming up as something that people talk about. Like we talk wildlife the whole time and then that comes up. And I think it points to how important having something like that
Well, I think it's no coincidence that people who live and work in places that are along the fringe of the developed world tend to arrive at the conviction that there should be fewer of us in the future than there are now. And that I would like that to happen in an easy way that works well for our species. But I really do hope that we don't continue to expand into these places, the last wild places we have left.
Yeah, I'm very pro-human. I like humans.
Me too.
I'm happy that I'm here. I'm happy that we're all here. But I don't believe in a planet Earth that's just us. So I think that's an important thing. And for the longevity of all of us, that's probably an important message. But anyways, Down from the Mountain, I'm super excited to read it. And I'm sure everybody listening will hear me talk about it on several other podcasts from now. Bryce, thanks so much for coming on. Congratulations on the book. I'm sure it's amazing. Super excited to read it. And for everybody else listening, as always, thank you. Until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.